Hello everyone, today we talk about peasants, revolts, and more in general, those struggles in medieval history, in low medieval history at this point, that were carried out by social classes without representatives, Um, this is a very interesting topic in my opinion. I've already made a couple of videos about medieval peasantry, and especially peasant revolts. Not just those. I mean, those were often intertwined even with city revolts, as we will see today. But in that sense, I was referring mostly to the salaried workers of the great textile industries, we can say, of some of the most important centers, one of the wealthiest regions in Europe, and it's a moment, it's a dramatic history, right? We have already, if you look like for Schwerpunkt peasant revolts, you can find that, and I talked already extensively about this topic, so I won't be repeating myself too much today, as I often do instead. And this is just a reflection, fundamentally, on the, let's say, on the difficulty that we have sometimes in interpreting history as a trans class phenomenon, right? We sometimes, especially certain historiography, has wanted to stress the fact that essentially it was that class that did that and that other class that did that, as if first of all you could distinguish social classes quite easily, right? Especially in this moment in history, right? Because this is technically already ancien regime, but it's not quite sclerotized and structured and divided, right, like it would become in modern times. This is a moment, on the contrary, of great experimentation. It's a moment in which the lower classes, very often those without representatives at one point, struggled pretty hard. They fought and died, ending up massacred in the end, in order to win their place in there. And it's a very complicated history because you see, these are fundamentally the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages. You can see that in the previous centuries already. For example, peasant communities were pretty dynamic. They were pretty even aggressive, right? There is a and this is also another side of the story that I don't like. When we talk about oppression, for example, we assume that whoever is oppressed is fundamentally, morally superior to someone else. It's really not the case, right? Of course, history can also be interpreted as a history of oppression. Everybody kind of oppresses someone else in a way or another. The point, though, is that if you look especially at the peasantry, they had at some points were really put against a wall, for which they had no other option but to break violently in the order. But when peasantry was left alone, and you can see it pretty well, in fact, in all the centuries preceding the last 2 of the Middle Ages, peasants were a community of extreme violence, of extreme prevarication. When then they took all what they could, and this doesn't mean, of course, we have to blame them as like they were the worst, they were scum. No, they were what they were, so we don't have to idealize or glorify, but not even to stigmatize or condemn as such. History requires this constant work of understanding, re-elaboration. And you see that the peasantry struggled, of course, at one point in history, for getting that place into political representatives. And today we are used, in fact, to believe that fundamentally peasants were always oppressed in one way or another. At the point they never had a real space on their own. Well, that's fundamentally a classist interpretation that doesn't take into account several factors that today we will try to take in account, at least a pair of them especially, that are the most important. And it doesn't take into account great part, in fact, of medieval history and how it was really like. I mean, peasant communities were extremely powerful at one point. they had the ability, if you look at the local level, what they were able to do, challenging the nobility, challenging the, I don't know, the local monasteries, etc., is really meaningful. And how do you frame the peasantry, honestly? Because if you consider essentially even the power of the feudal institutions, or also the communal ones, you can't pretend to see this as the lord or the city sitting on the back of these peasants who were just breaking their backs on the land, and nothing else. Like an absolute state where peasants had zero political influence. They had nothing to say. They had nothing to deal for, like, in the social contract. This is a wrong picture that has been stressed by classist, often Marxist interpretation of history, that doesn't quite fit. Aside from, of course, the relative, of course, let's say, subordination that, of course, the peasants had in this time. But once again, you can't just interpret it easily like that. And not to say that life of other communities was easy, because also another rhetorical expedient to stress such ideas is something like, the peasants were just, in fact, starving to death, while the rest of communities were fine, right? Cities, everything was fine, and the nobility, everything was fine. No, it was a pretty damn messed up reality, in which not only the general quality of life was astonishingly low for our standards, but there was an incredible political instability that escalated in open warfare on a regular basis, and that entailed, like, the participation even of these lower strata of the population, that whether you like it or not, they participated actively. Of course, maybe subordinated to this or that power, but never in a completely passive fashion. They had something to demand. And the 14th and 15th century, they're dramatic centuries. Especially the 14th is pretty harsh. Like, think about the Jacquerie and also other, especially in the second half of the century. I mean, that's the moment of probably the greatest reivindications from the side of the peasantry. They continue, of course, during the early 15th century, but even you can't find them easily. Even, I don't know, take the Protestant Reformation. Look at what the peasant war in Germany was at the beginning of 16th century. I mean, certain things obviously depend in terms of time and place, but let's say in this most structured and advanced areas of the continent, you realize that in the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, the peasantry is brought, it goes under, right? It's kept down. It basically lost. It lost its struggle. And not to say that they technically didn't have the force to change it, like to win it. Like, they really had the opportunity at one point. Today we won't be discussing why this happened. Of course, this has to do with mainly a lack of organization, all the problems that you can imagine, even environmentally speaking, in the infrastructures that were held by other powers. But this is still not an excuse, because when all the peasantry rebelled all together, like in many others, in several other, at least, historical contexts, you realize that even in much more modern times, there is nothing you can do about that. And this is also Clausewitzian principle, right? If the government, whichever it is, doesn't have 50% plus one people and strengths, let's say, with him, the government loses and it's overthrown, right? So it sounds very simple, and you may say, well, but it's too that simple. Well, yeah, that's why I stress force is not really people, because sometimes it's not really the same thing. And obviously, what the most let's say iconic and or popular picture we have of peasantry is, in fact, from the modern age. I mean, it's widely known, historiographically speaking, that peasants had it much worse in the modern age than they had in the Middle Ages. Like, if you look at quality of life, well, the modern age were much more exploitative towards the peasantry than they were towards during the Middle Ages, right? Simply because the social hierarchies were kind of weaker, right? And I mean, they were stronger in the modern age and weaker in the Middle Ages. And the peasants had their own power, and as we were saying before, peasants had their own troops. They had their own. I mean, if you look at the majority, even of armies that were levied out there, sometimes we say medieval armies were a bit more than, most of them were about peasants, like with I don't know how to say, with pitchforks, like stuff like that. It wasn't quite like that. During most of the Middle Ages, the actual combat fighting force, medieval armies, was actually composed by fairly well-equipped troops. Like, if you really have to use peasants with pitchforks, it's not gonna be very well. Just use maybe one of them, but levy it among, I don't know, 4 people. Like, it was usually done, so that those can keep him in a kind of a decent fashion, and maybe he's even on average a more combative individual than the others, maybe also younger, and whatever. So actually, even peasants, when we say that peasants composed the majority of medieval armies, it's in this sense. They were levied from the peasantry, but not that they were literally peasants with pitchforks, right? Of course, there was plenty of other troops that didn't quite fight in themselves, but it was plenty of, surely, even peasants of other people that joined the armies to pillage, to raid, to raise to the ground, also for paving the road to the army, and kind of trying to get something from spoils of war, whatever. But that's not really part of the army as such, right? There are lots of field aids, etc. All this for saying that when you look at armies in the Middle Ages, you realize that the peasantry component, in this sense, was very important, right? They weren't just, in fact, throwaway troops. Some were decently equipped, and they made an important part of this army. So already, if you consider this, you can see how important in the equation sometimes these elements were. And what is the peasantry anyway? This is also what we have to challenge. Is it the peasant that really has nothing but a hut that works for his noble, or is it, I don't know, well-off peasant farmer, let's say, that has maybe a sharecropping land that he manages with, of course, not in a terrific life, so but still with some degree of wealth, considering the average peasant. Or maybe he's a free peasant with in some communities that also have a weight on the land or something like that. So this all depends on when, where, but the situation is much more diversified than it seems, and therefore also talking about peasantry in general terms, as if the countryside didn't have its own administration, regulation, and so on, is irrealistic, especially at this time. But aside from this, there is also a big historical debate going on. I think still going on. Looking at all these movements, like the Jacquerie chiefly, that was most important, but you can find them scattered all over Europe sometimes, and many others that also we don't know about, right? And let me open another parenthesis. I promise we will finish that phrase now in a while. I just wanted to tell you that we are, of course, much better documented about what was happening in the main centers of power, chiefly the great dynasties and the great cities and whatever. When it takes to understand what was happening in the countryside, things get way more complicated. They are not easy at all, and simply because in part from this you can already sense that maybe the countryside is maybe less important than other centers, and this is true. But at the same time, there is also a sort of maybe they're separated worlds sometimes, maybe not completely, but even geographically speaking, there are certain areas that are usually populated in different ways, that have different lifestyle, they have a different mindset, and that sometimes even escape the control of the major centers of powers. I mean, certain places, especially in the mountain valleys or in the forests, especially in Central Northern Europe, I mean, they live very detached from other circuits, and sometimes they didn't write. Okay, they didn't leave any, written record. They didn't have a bureaucracy and administration. So basically, we know nothing about them. When in this period, for example, monastic centers have already entered a deep economical crisis. They were selling everything, including their own older documents that produced this hemorrhage of material. Unfortunately, maybe you can't find those papers or those pergaments, telling you the truth, that point used as covers of other books that were written by notaries later on, etc. That, however, show mostly what had been in previous centuries. That is basically what happened in the countryside wasn't known except for the monasteries. The monasteries were obviously, for obvious reasons, the only ones at one point that basically wrote anything in terms of history, in terms of even local records. But law is also very important. Law and this placita, for example, as it were called, this juridical assizes, trials fundamentally, in which the monasteries usually kept record of only when they won. Right, the Middle Ages was like that. Law was extremely important because you could control society through it. It was a matter of money, but especially it could give you this. It settled matters. Contrarily to what people believe, actually, medieval justice was pretty efficient for the times, and law was extremely important. There was a very sophisticated juridical. There is a great intelligence emerging from the juridical praxis that is incredible. If any of you has ever read a medieval juridical source, but we can't talk about as early as the early Middle Ages. I'm not talking about, because many people assume that, I don't know, before the late Middle Ages there wasn't a civilization. False. False in the sense that obviously it's false, but more than that, what we have before is also pretty eloquent about the world. Was extremely well regulated, dynamic, lively, and basically the monks had a lot of problems against the peasantry. Obviously, we talk about chiefly this post year 1000 period in which both the monastic communities and the peasant communities have structured themselves pretty soundly. Like in the early Middle Ages, there was a conspicuous friendship and even alliance between the monasteries and the local rural communities. But when demography increases, economy increases, let's say everything gets, society becomes also more conflictual. Peasant societies, leagues, even certain communes, villages start to fight even against the monasteries that at this time have their own military retinues and whatever. So it's all but a popular picture that we get from that period, but it was actually like that. So in the countryside, where the monastic centers had spread historically, and of course where the peasant communities were, there were these extreme clashes, sometimes even escalating in warfare, that were at one point regulated by local justice, if there was any, like if the feudal, like there was usually. Otherwise, they would make justice in their own way, which doesn't mean necessarily resorting to violence, right? It literally means building their own justice system, which was an actual thing, as we were saying before. And this was exactly the point, is that when we get of course the monks were kind of more advanced in virtue production, and they preserved chiefly only those settlements, those legal settlements that had favored them, that had seen them as winners. So that was the all the deal at that point, because if one king or one count had declared that the monastery could keep that land, that it belonged to them, because there were also all these jurisdictional problems at the base of controlling territories and hence communities more than before than even resources, because resources were normally already there has always been someone, especially in certain areas of Europe. It's not that they were to be discovered. Well, the monks would maintain that diploma if instead the peasants won. The monks had no interest in maintaining preserving that settlement, but the peasants couldn't do it for themselves, so that would basically go lost. And we know how dramatically feel about the peasants, right? Even though we can observe it from the monastic perspective, and therefore we already, this gives you the idea of how actually powerful at some point the peasants were, and what they could achieve. I mean, as we were saying before, from the peasant communities would evolve also other, I don't know, even towns, right? There were historically some villagers community that kind of communities that got together politically, and they formed something else. I mean, just think. Maybe that's excessive because it's so big, but just think about the Swiss Confederation. That was basically something similar. Even if there were cities, it was a bit more complicated. They weren't just peasants. But I don't know, think about the Dithmarscher, for example. Those were really peasants, and they didn't have quite a few. I mean, they future as themselves. They would exist. They would have their own thing. They would defeat armies of nobles and whatever, but they remained peasants at the end of the day. These are endless topics. Like we could talk so much about every one of these single realities, and at one point we'll have to do it, because we're still in the phase of we talked maybe. I think we never actually made a video about the single communities, if not in the case of certain cities, certain scenery, but we will have to do it, right? We will end at one point hopefully the strictly manualistic or slash basic approach to these matters, to get a bit more into the details, but just for saying how complex the situation was. And what it was about to finish was this concept that is a big historiographical problem, right? Of all of these peasants in peasant communities that we know, also of those that we don't know about because maybe they were slaughtered, whether they were actually the most miserable strata of the rural population, or they rather were maybe peasants coming to money, right? This is an important discriminant here. Because actually, when you see a great clash that involves bloodshed and warfare, whatever, that usually indicates either like a desperate situation for which there is a massive social disruption of some sort, like it objectively would happen. I mean, if you look at the Jacquerie, for example, you see that the kingdom of France at that point had fallen to zero. Like at that point, basically the king couldn't defend anyone. These peasants were literally being butchered down by the English, by the set of mercenaries. They had to take arms, and that was a good option for them. Not much to take arms against just the invaders, but also against their their former rulers, the nobility that maybe had refused to help them. They had enclosed in their own castles, whatever. and the Jacquerie was really a big thing. Like first of all, there were several revolts. I mean, it's not very simple. We'll never talk in detail about that, but we will have to do it in one day. But that is a situation that speaks for the structural damage, right? In more contained and probably some of the most frequent cases, instead, we're talking about maybe communities that had some ambition of sort, right? So when we look at this peasant revolts, our first thought shouldn't be like, oh, look at these were just starving to these peasants were just starving to death because they were oppressed. Not really, not always. These are phenomena that can be interpreted also in terms of outcome of social mobility, rather. For example, with sort of convergence with sectors, of course, of lower classes, of peasants, but also, for example, with the low clergy or the small chivalric nobility. That was a thing as well. I mean, these weren't just peasant communities; these were local communities that were socially segmented, right? And it's very, very frequent, actually, to find into the so-called peasant revolts lots of clergy, but also a lot of nobles as well. And that's where classist interpretations of history can be thrown out of the window, because you understand there that, of course, that might have been a problem of class, of exploitation, of oppression, wherever you call that. But if you have noblemen there, you understand that there is something else going on. And what is going on in here, naturally, is typical of the political medieval landscape, which is characterized by the presence of such a huge plurality of communities, of general poor political control of the territory, in fact, political and social evils, etc. It's like I was reading even stuff about, for example, the slaughters of the Jews during somewhat the same period, right? Sometimes they were driven objectively by sheer ideological fanatism and anti-Semitism, but when you look at the deeper reasons of humankind, at the end of the day, you realize that most of the times, maybe especially in the richest burgher communities, what is that these people wanted from the Jews? They wanted their money. They wanted to steal their money. So you massacre the Jews, and you take their money. And this is, there are many studies about this. They're very interesting because they show you also the rest of the Jewish population was at that point not even emarginated. That was just claiming that were heathens and whatever to steal their property, and that was done because they were a minority. So there's not much they could do, unfortunately. And these are sometimes the most trivial human behaviors that are loaded then with hate and prejudice and contempt and fanatism of all sort, and cruelty, of course, and evil. But also sometimes they're much more shaded than monocolor interpretations, like these peasants were slaughtered just because everybody hated the peasants. Well, no, it doesn't quite work like that. Things are always way more complicated historically than simplistic interpretations. So, and what is interesting, and I think it's worth remembering it, is that the first half of the 14th century, especially, was the period of the emancipation of the let's say, of certain middle classes in several areas of Europe. Some of them were also peasants. We mentioned the Dithmarscher in Schleswig or in Holstein, that in the north of Germany, even some the Swiss. But also think about the Flemish commoners, or even maybe if you look at the wars of Scottish independence, you'll see that there was this monarchy was essentially forming in Scotland with some kind of feudal characters the thing was much more, um, the, they had to take a form compared to other. I don't know. There is no comparison with the English monarchy, for example. But just for saying that those victories can be interpreted sometimes even by these masses of lightly, poorly equipped Scottish peasants at the end of the day that the feudal levy had. I mean, not even feudal levy, actually the arrière-ban, I mean, the ancient militia levy, the territory of the land can represent. So there had been a phase that, in this sense, is pretty neatly defined in the first half of the 14th century, whereas the second half of the 14th century is mostly about the peasants, that had seen the rise of commoners and the actual victory of some of them. Like, even if they would be crushed in part in the battlefield, and especially with the Black Death, all those victories of infantry fundamentally decline. They stop, right? There is a sort of refeudalization up to the mid of the 15th century, medieval European military culture. Let's say, you realize that the peasantry, that there had been other classes that had managed to emancipate. I don't know whether this concept has ever been formulated as such, but it seems like in the great expansion of Europe in the previous centuries had at this point is shattered. The base is have shrink to a much narrower dimension because of the plague, because of this financial crisis, whatever. So there is this ferocious struggle actually between all the various communities, right? You can interpret it in many ways. Even kingdoms fundamentally start launching offensives because they need money desperately. Like the case of the Flemish cities is pretty eloquent. I mean, the French invaded those areas, not just because they needed money, but chiefly like because of that, or at least not to make them fall into the hands of the English. And so it's a very complicated story, actually, and today we won't be talking about that specifically, but it gives you the idea of how this was a extremely ferocious fight for survival, in which some even of the greatest political and social institutions of the time, like kingdoms, were in deep trouble, right? They were in deep trouble. Then eventually they would have the genetic structure to survive, to manage to restructure it. I mean, see what happened to the Kingdom of France during the 100 Years' War. It was extremely disruptive, yet the French crown manages to rebuild, to rise once again. So it means that these models were extremely successful, and never underestimate the power of hierarchies, because we need hierarchies, because those are the proofs that in this moment of disruption, Europe doesn't die out like it had happened in late antiquity, where where it died out fundamentally and transformed into something else. The Middle Ages structured themselves better, right? This decline, this fall doesn't bring to chaos, disorder at the point. No, it strengthened. The structuration becomes exactly there. And this structuration, however, did pass, and this is true, absolutely, did pass through the sacrifice of some other communities, right? So whether it was this, let's say, objective shortage of resources, or whether it was that others wanted to strengthen their own power for the sake of political survival, if anything, the peasants were in the middle of this, and eventually they ended up losing this fight. They ended up being subjugated definitely by this system, and losing their opportunity of gaining a representance in the ancien regime, as we mention it. While the middle classes, for example, didn't. The rich burghers, the bourgeois, let's say, were objectively capable of assuming that power, of remaining power, of being represented in the king's assemblies. And what I would like to make you understand that in fact this language is kind of already pertaining to the Ancien regime. During the Middle Ages, technically every single community was defended by kings. There was not the idea that, no, this is a community of peasants, the king doesn't have to care about them. Absolutely not. The base of the medieval juridical practice was that every community in the kingdom had to be protected by the king, and fundamentally the king's duty and legitimization of his power was based exclusively on that. It's only towards the throughout this time that the kings start stressing their own, divine, mandate and all this stuff. But in terms of strict political and juridical practices, that had been the case. So the fact that the peasants were left out is even more meaningful, because theoretically there was no pre-existing limitation that I should have let them out, right? And still, let's consider, however, that these hierarchies that took over eventually weren't all the worst thing that could happen to these peasants, right? Exploitation increased, of course, oppression increased, but at the same time, this was a clienterly world. Hierarchies have this vertical dimension for which, if the top is successful, well, usually also the rest of the communities are successful. And if you look at this in historical perspective, the Ancien regime guided Europe through the expansion of the modern age. So at one point it broke down. It of course paid for the oppression that it had carried out, but it was chiefly because of the enrichment of the middle classes, right, that had power to participate once again. It's not that the poorest classes had it particularly better at the end of the day, so you can't even say that was the main reason, right, why this system crumbled. Like the peasantry in general suffered a lot, but it was also kind of proud, for example, being under a particular order or being under that particular noble. It was for those minds, it was very clear how this hierarchy managed to hold everything together, which it really did, which is the most amazing thing. And social differences were deemed as necessary by these individuals, even if we know a few about their perspective, but there are much more recent times, even part of literature. Think about Resurrection by Tolstoy. If you read that, but you realize that peasants in their mindset was so rooted in what the tradition, the usage was, that they didn't even conceive the idea of being free, because it was more than that. And the problem, it's really with us at this point, that we fail to realize what that world was like. We have to apply this idea of a political, moral ideals in a time in which they did not work. It's not they weren't there, intrinsically speaking. There are reflections on the misery of the peasants. There is this contempt expressed, that there is this violence, but still that system worked. It functioned. It was functional for that type of potential that existed at the time. And always bear in mind that those were pre-industrial moments. If those who made the whole thing going on was literally peasants, right? So even the story of complete oppression, that we're obliged to do all of this without thinking, is not realistic. It doesn't consider the most basic needs of protection, for example, that peasant communities had and that brought them necessarily under the protection of someone else. That was particularly important. That's how the whole concept of seigneury had developed. It was a necessity. It wasn't an imposition initially. It happened through imposition as well. It developed further through imposition. It came to a point in the late modern age in which this was not sustainable anymore, in which people were starving to death because there were whole systemic problems at this point that weren't even depending on the oppression, but maybe on the markets, on the global trade that was developing, things that really matter. At that point, well, if I have to starve to death, it's better for me to really take a pitchfork and start killing, was obliging me to pay for what I produce fundamentally, because I have to eat something, otherwise I will die in turn. So that's literally how it happened. But never think that this system was kind of rigged or it didn't work, because it was literally the system through which every pre-industrial society had ever worked like, and every other alternative is fictitious, right, in the history of mankind, especially at some point of development, right? And there is this tendency of societies to generally build this kind of relations. This idea that social classes are needed because there are differentiations, and society is articulated. It needs several different occupations and formations, etc. So it's explainable, and the reason why saying things like this is unpopular is because objectively there has been a time after the Second World War in which a certain, at least in certain countries, a certain political, even during decades of contestation, fundamentally, that there's been a branch of the academy that has stressed not the objectivity of history, but the political interpretation of history as a criterion of historical research. That, of course, today we are rejecting, fortunately, at least in the country where I live. I must say, yeah, there is a sort of coming back of such ideas, but the current historiography we know here is very is devoid now. If you talk about such political perspectives, even and considering the professors come straight from that period of contestation, now it's it's ridiculous, right? They tell you, no, you can't study here, you can't interpret history like that, it's stupid. Even if those professors maybe do own similar ideas, but they are intelligent and competent enough to say this has nothing to do with what we see historically in certain degrees, and at least in the excesses that such interpretations wanted to stress. But still there is a big stigma coming from one part of this ideologized fringes that want to tell if you try to interpret history in a different way, it's fundamentally wrong. You're the worst person ever living, and there is a lot. This is a problem, because especially in the United States, in the UK, certain things are coming back quite potently and quite worryingly, because you wonder what they even mean in this historical period after all what happened, all what we know about these stories, and also our most recent past that has proved many interesting things that collide pretty sharply with these interpretations, so the problem of saying were these peasants like the poorest ones, or they had also low clergy and nobility helping them, low nobility helping them, it doesn't even matter anymore, because basically all these things were always coexisting, which means that this is not a vertical division, this is an horizontal division, which means that maybe, I don't know, these were communities who simply wanted to gain autonomies on their own, so even the local nobility would participate to it by exploiting peasant power. That's how the same seigneuries had been established back in the day. It was the armed peasantry that had backed even the development of the nobility, right? And even impeded it on some occasion. Common, however, to all the uprisings that are posterior to the mid of the 14th century is that these have as protagonists the strata of the populations that were excluded from every participation to power. Right? That is, social classes without representatives. I don't know how you put the accent. Sorry, today I feel blah like that. So this is important because in the first half of the 14th century, we have seen that there were more delineated political and social powers were struggling for their independence. There could be entire kingdoms, that is national blocks, or they could be national. Well, you understand what I mean. Proto-national groups, or however, groups that were forming, in fact, maybe the sense of belonging to a political, to a polity, to a new kingdom, to new hierarchies, as a matter of fact. So that even this force that had come from the lower strata was actually backing the existence of hierarchies, and always reflect about this because it's not so immediate, right? Obviously, hierarchies were trying to do the same thing, like framing these elements always more into the under their control, but still, it was both things at the same time. This is what we fail to recognize all the time. It's when we have to draw this line. Oh no, it was just the oppressors who wanted to oppress the poor. No, it wasn't like that. These are much deeper and complex dynamics. You can't reduce them to that. That's simplistic. That doesn't. We know historiographically speaking now from several decades that it's not like that. It's been demonstrated. So what can we say? It's very meaningful that in the second half of the 14th century instead, we have communities now that probably are realizing, maybe because the world dynamics have been accelerated and brutally accelerated maybe by the plague and other phenomena, that they're being left out, that the room available is being occupied by someone else, and that they're losing that. And that's why they start fighting for gaining it. We don't have to be surprised by the fact that rustics committed into armored struggles were sometimes guided, however, by individuals who were militarily prepared and that belonged to the lesser aristocracy, because they were committed into a social conflict that needed the contingent alliance of other more or less organized forces. This is important. I made a video, I think, more than 1 year ago about the case of Sahagun in Spain. That it's one of that came into my mind. That actually we made an example about this stuff. That is not exclusively about this. I mean, I think it doesn't arrive to the late Middle Ages, but that was interesting because it showed how sometimes even the peasants were sometimes the best allies of the king on some occasion. That can see even with shepherds in particular in areas where the wool production is particularly intense, like in southern Italy or in Spain, but Sahagun wasn't the case. Against the local nobility, the baronial rule, that is also typical. You see that, and another combination that makes you understand the peasants were searching now. They weren't struggling against oppressors. They were fighting with alongside the highest hierarchies, and not because they liked. Let's be honest about it. Let's be completely frank about this. Nobody liked each other. Every social group was in competition with each other. But it's exactly because of this that these combinations were necessary, right? Always going back the moment on in the first half of the 14th century, when, for example, in the Battle of Courtrai or Kortrijk, you find the local Flemish nobility that decided to kind of emancipate itself from the system there, and it starts backing this local urban militias that knew nothing about war by definition, and that, instead now were organized and directed, militarily speaking, during the battles by this noblemen that knew more or less their business about war, and that also led them to victory. That is quite important. That is quite important, because you realize at that point it's not merely a feudal versus urban clash. It's much more than that. It's much more than that. But also very famously, we talked about certain peasants' revolts in the other videos, such as during the Jacquerie. The French rebels of the 1358, for example, found this link with the supporters of Etienne Marcel, that was that were basically those citizens of Paris that had been in turn rose up against the royal officials that were loyal to the regent, while the French king had fallen prisoner to the English one. And that is another great example. In that case, you find that the Jacquerie is vehiculated in part by the Parisian bourgeoisie. So, what's that case then? Were the peasants against all the rest of the world? Obviously not. Obviously not. They were linked to that elite that was much wealthier than them, and also had, you can say, exploited them, meaning that, those Parisian merchants had made, they had become fat rich with all the trade and, and work of those peasants as well, in part. The trade of the goods produced by the peasants. And it's even incorrect, in my opinion, to put it in these terms, frankly, because that sounds just as if, the peasants didn't. Maybe the peasants were happy, maybe to even sell to those than someone else. So it all depends, and you have to look at the context and at how this the various local balances were in order to understand something about this. After all, not saying, oh no, it was just the peasants who were oppressed. Point. They rebelled and started killing nobles. They did weird things. No, you can't say that. It wasn't just that. There was blind violence. There was fanatism. There was hate. There was oppression. There was this sense of injustice. Sure, there was all of this, but it wasn't only this. Politics it poses you in front of the choice of negotiation. You can't go anywhere if you don't negotiate. And what is it better to be killed by the I don't know, by the nobles, whatever, just without having asked any help to anyone? What do you think the peasants even had okay, yes, we have seen that the peasants had the ability to achieve that in part, but eventually also, why did they fail? Because maybe they asked too much at one point. Because it's always like this. As long as you see that you gain power, you don't stop, and you become overconfident. You start losing the. That's also why the Jacquerie was repressed so violently, in part because it had gone very far. That means also very close to what the peasants could achieve, but yet they failed anyway, and that is quite meaningful, because it's not unrealistic for the French peasants to have gained at one point some form of political representation if they had maybe managed the situation in a bit more of a concerted way. At that point, there's also ignorance, of course. Like, these were classes that had a very few coordination. They didn't know much about each other. They also had their own. I mean, peasantry had absolutely no class feeling. Like, a peasant from Burgundy was different from a peasant from Champagne, just for example. They in every district, every village had their own mindset, their own identity. I mean, they didn't have that level of broader and shared coordination. Maybe the nobility of Europe could have. The burghers of the the major cities, for example, could have with each other international trade, traffics, whatever. You can't understand even the education, literacy, whatever. The here was lacking. The peasants didn't have any of that. How could they coordinate the whole thing? That's one reason why also they lost it. But there is also the other example of England that is very important. The English rebels of 1381, to whom had also, that had also been joined by, even in there, by the clergy, of the lower clergy, also in that sense, especially that clergy who had pauperistic evangelic ideas, for not talking about members of the small rural nobility, of the lesser rural nobility, reflect about that. We're gaining solidarity also of great part of the London citizenry, except for the rich burghers and the not few urban elites of the southeastern, let's say southern and southeastern English urban centers. So just on that occasion, for example, it seems more like a contestation of the hierarchies on that point, because it was aimed at that partially, and England also had a pretty solid institutional system, like, and even in there the repression was very brutal, but at the same time, go look at what the English had managed to organize. Like, I made a video just I think one month ago. It was Kingdom of England and Institutional Profile, 1250 1500 circa, that talks about that, and it shows how objectively the Kingdom of England functioned up to, well, major crisis didn't occur, like in this case, because also usual war expenses and this, of course, vexations and need of money was, of course, levied from the peasants' work, etc. So it's important. This is not to deny the violence, it's not to deny the exploitation, it's not to deny anything. It's on the contrary, understanding that these things flare every once in a while. There is an imbalance, every time there is an imbalance, and this balance yet has to be understood, because otherwise this would have been like constant peasant revolts everywhere, right? Instead, it wasn't quite like that. I mean, yeah, every once in a while something broke out, but essentially it happened for certain reasons that you have to analyze each time. So sometimes these topics are even addressed like tyrannies, like this obsession for tyranny. There is an obsession for tyranny as much as there is an obsession for the fear of the lower classes. And it's in the middle that probably the response has to be. But in my opinion, I think that the hierarchies have an edge. I mean, the hierarchies are more intelligent. And that's why they are there. Because they have to work on the base of competence. So, symmetry does not exist at any time. In politics, in society, in war, there has never been anything conceivable as symmetry. So there is always someone who has an advantage, someone who has a disadvantage. The problem though is that this can this can vary during a clash. It does vary all the time. And if these peasant revolts have been all crushed, well, that probably tells you a lot about the capability of the hierarchies, their intelligence, their understanding, and their structuration, and the reason of their success. That's what I think it like. I don't think there is any other way to put it here. I'm very I admire these hierarchies, and I can't avoid to recognize that when there is a when you recur to violence, and it's at that point you have to cope with violence, with other violence, you have to realize what is at stake. So from the peasant side, you should be able to understand really the level of misery that in some cases occurred, but also the fact that usually the most miserable classes, historically speaking, are never able to do anything without someone moving them. Look at the great revolutions, or look at communism. Who was it that rebelled? The lower strata? No, there was someone else going there telling them what to do in order to achieve that. And there were, let's say, I mean, that was on some occasion a matter of I don't want to reason in deterministic ways, but of course there were a breaking point. Like I, for example, believe that I don't know, there is a legitimate question, like, for example, take the Bolshevik Revolution. Was it unavoidable? I mean, that's a serious historical question, because it's not so to be given for granted, as it's not given for granted that the USSR actually happened, in the sense that if you look at what Lenin was confronted with at the beginning of Civil War, like, it was the odds were hopeless. Von Clausewitz helped, because Lenin and communist thinkers, actually, all in military history, they have a strong Clausewitzian formation in terms of military culture, and not because von Clausewitz was communist or whatever. It has nothing to do with that. It's just because that specific political doctrine decided to read and adopt von Clausewitz. That's the reason. I don't like communism at all, just for being clear here. But it's nevertheless, there was a civilization behind that. I mean, there isn't civilization in the sense of, it takes intelligence to win. And the case of Lenin is an example of an intellectual that needs to make things work, and not just brute force, right? And so here with the peasants, the same exact thing. You can't think the peasants would do everything on their own, because usually the lowest strata of the population, the most miserable, are not capable. They have an intellective deficit, or better, an intellectual deficit that they don't, that is needed in war. In war, it's always, by rule, it's the most intelligent who wins, not the strongest. So consider also this, that the peasants were the ones that literally produced everything, almost at the time. And yet, that wasn't enough for them to rise. But at the same time, you also have to consider that maybe they weren't that oppressed for making them feel in the need of rebelling either. Because if you interpret history in a classist way, you should be given that, give that, there should have been a sort of permanent revolution, because everybody would have been, oppressed, so they would have simply risen. At one point, it was a state of constant control. Yeah, and in part that's true as well. Like if you don't, it's a myth. The idea that peasants wouldn't seize the opportunities they had violently when they had the means, right? Just an example, that's a reason why Tsarist Russia had disarmed all the countryside, right? And that's the reason why the Russian Revolution happened during the First World War, because that was the first time in Russian history in which there was a mass army, that is, a peasant army, given that the overwhelming majority of Russians was nothing but peasants, that were armed. That means that they were given rifles in their hands. But not even this explains it. You see how complicated this is. These are all determining factors, but they're never decisive in themselves. And that's why history is complicated, because there are certain things that are objectively difficult to tell until you don't realize certain things. But believe me, I also have a materialist idea of history in part, right? In the last years, I've violently reevaluated the idealistic side of history, because it's of extreme importance. But I believe that they constantly interact, as a matter of fact. It's not one or the other. And also the materialist side, the material side of the story is very important here. Some of these guys were literally starving to death. Some of them, though. Not all of them. That's the idea. But just for the record, this whole concept, I think, has to problematize the certain categories of interpretation. But the most fascinating thing about it is that instead it's all quite simple in the end, right? And it's simple as long as you abandon those categories. If you're able to understand that communities are always mixed, that communities always work for different reasons that vary at times, and that there is no monolithic social division, right? So this is particularly important to me. It's particularly meaningful. It makes sense when you study history. The rest is fanatism, in fact. It's ideologism. And that's how I see it personally, but I think it's really worth the pain considering it as an idea, because it objectively makes sense. And that's what most of our historiographical accomplishments showed us to be the case of, right, basically all the time. This is not a matter of discovering one source or another, is setting your mind on objective tracks. I'm not saying neutral tracks, because that would be impossible, but at least on something that resembles objectivity at an essential level, right? That is not interpreting history because you think that you have to kill someone through it. Like, there are many people who interpret history because they inherently want to find, this guy is evil, so this group is evil, these people are evil, so I want to destroy them by distorting history at my own consumption, so that works. No. I hope that we will come to a moment in which maybe, people will not go to jail for because of that, but in which you will have to take a responsibility for, especially if you are a teacher, a professor, some kind, when you start saying certain things, that you actually can be accountable for what you say, in the face, not of course of criminal censure, stuff like that, but also being, judged by the rest of the community. Like, if you start denying what's been, one thing is, here it's the problem is to substantiate what you claim with evidence, and most people are not able to do that. When you roam around the internet, you find so many people who pretend to substantiate history with facts, their hypothesis with historical facts, right? And there are people who even write entire books of complete lies, but just making paste and copy of historical facts. They simply misinterpret at their own consumption, right? I'm not saying that it's easy to be objective in history. I'm simply saying that it's extremely easy not to be objective in history, and that therefore understanding where where the right direction is telling the truth at one point. It's not very difficult after all, right? So I don't know how to conclude this video, because it was pretty weird, wasn't it? I mean, I usually don't talk about this stuff, but these are controversial topics as well. I realize that it's frequent, telling the truth, to hear about them, because people like the taste of blood, the fight of the ideological clash, or stuff like that. As you know, if you're a regular watcher, follower, I'm not like that. I never talk about this stuff, but and objectively today I neither talked about it, but I just tried to admonish you, like saying, just be aware that wherever you go, whoever you meet, you will always hear such extremizations of history, right? There is no way out of that. I suppose that it's even intellectually useful to know about such things, meaning that if there was just a single thought, well, we would be done for. Like, nobody would like to live in a world with single thought, right? But that's exactly the point. Never interpret history like in an ideological fashion, because that's the best way to or towards that direction, and it's not good. Alright, so I think we can stop it here for today. And yeah, and we will come back on the topic. At one point we will have even to look in detail at all these various revolts in detail, and especially also other minor but very meaningful political interactions between various communities, and also involving the peasantry. A little bit, especially in the previous centuries, that are more interesting, because there the peasantry has kind of more contractual power in this sense. Okay, let's hope we will manage to do it. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.